Fantasy fiction. You know those books that have wizards and dragons and unicorns and elves? Stuff like that? We call those kinds of stories fantasy. The word fantasy basically means imaginary, make believe, or pretend, and comes from an older word meaning visions or dreams. The same word that gives us fandom. Fantasy books come from imagination, but all fiction comes from imagination. So, what makes fantasy different from other kinds of fiction? Well, fantasy contains unreal things that could never be real in our world. Fantasy breaks the rules of what we know. Magical fairies that grant wishes live in your backyard? No problem. One eyed ogres that fall in love at first sight? Sure. Those things aren't real in our world, but fantasy authors make unreal things real in the world of their stories. A fantasy book might be set in a completely made up universe or in a made up version of the real world with a few new rules for what's normal. In a fantasy book, teenagers might grow wings during puberty instead of armpit hair. When strange things happen, it's because of something unreal or unexplainable. In other words, magic or make believe. Sometimes the fantasy genre means every kind of fiction that isn't realistic. It can be a very general category that includes fairy tales, folk tales, spooky stories, animal stories, sci fi, and anything else that has some kind of make believe in it. But usually, when we say fantasy, we mean the specific category of modern or contemporary fantasy, which is literature that has unreal story elements, but a real known author. That makes it different from traditional fantasy, which includes all the myths and legends that were first told a long time ago and shared by people, not books. So we don't really know the real author or the original author. The amount of unreal things in modern fantasy varies from high to low. Well, some books are set in entirely different imaginary worlds filled with creatures, places, and objects that never existed. These high fantasy books often involve lowly characters, like ordinary people, who grow and change after a journey or quest against the forces of evil. Well, I hope that sounds familiar because that storyline has been reused and remixed in like a gazillion movies and video games. Think about it. Some fantasy stories keep most of the real world, but change just a few normal things into magical things. These low fantasy books have characters who discover magical creatures, places, or objects that had been hidden or forgotten. And also, many children's and young adult fantasy books are set in magical places that are connected to the real world by a magic word, key, or portal. When you're a kid, your dreams and wishes feel like they really could be just behind a mysterious door or deep inside a hidden cave. We never forget those feelings. And fantasy authors love taking us back to the land of make believe. And even though it's fantasy, we make connections from the issues and troubles characters face to what happens in our own lives. If the protagonist is fighting a big, scary dragon, it might make you think about how it feels to conquer your own big, scary fear, or a big, scary test, or some big, scary bully. Exploring these strange, mysterious worlds in fantasy can actually help us explore the strange, mysterious world we call reality. So, yes, that's fantasy, and it's set in imaginary worlds where things are unreal because of different rules or magic. And that's why we love it, because anything can happen. Fantasy authors dream up anything from a magical stone to a magical galaxy and bring us along for the journey. So, fantasy uses imaginary things to help us understand and deal with the real things. Alright, so let's go to the first slide. In addition to that, fantasy features stories set in fanciful, invented worlds, just like in Harry Potter, an alternate and more fanciful version of our own world, or in a legendary, mythic past. And it generally involves magic, mystical elements, or supernatural creatures, such as this one. vampires. Fantasy also includes a large number of works and styles ranging from pseudo-mythological epics like Lord of the Rings to more deliberately modern works such as Harry Potter or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and includes works which also fall under other genres such as horror fiction, comedy, action adventure, or romance. So if you're familiar with this icon, this looks exactly like a wizard from Harry Potter. Okay? In fantasy literature seems free of the rules of both life and literature, such as time, space, three dimensions, and the border between animate and inanimate. It has also been defined as literature dominated by the unconscious mind. Other features which recur are a death, wish, invisibility, transformations, dualism, and good versus evil. And Isventan Tudor, the author of The Fantastic, says that fantasy lies somewhere between the purely marvelous belief in magical and the supernatural, in a purely uncanny, strange, because it is generated by the unconscious mind. In other words, these things are merely imaginary. He calls it the real literary of all the problem of establishing what is reality and what is meaning is a result of essential anxiety and unease. As with the world, we cannot come to terms with it, nor we can dismiss it. So yes, if you're familiar with these icons, the guy there on the right side looks like Frankenstein, and the girl there on the left side is actually Alice in Wonderland. Okay, fantasy began with folklore and romance. Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, introduced many of fantasy's basic forms, such as invisibility from the invisible girl, impossibility from the mortal immortal, and entropy or stasis, the cast man, and transformation, of course, from Frankenstein. Fantasy may be also a reversed version of the real world, just like Alice through the looking glass, if you're really familiar with the movie already. And also, fantasy replaces the solid, rounded characters of realist fiction with fragmented and insubstantial forms. Okay, so that's it for the fantasy fiction. Let's go to magical realism. Magical realism is somehow a bit similar to the previous topic, which is fantasy fiction, because they share some common characteristics. Alright, so when you say magical realism, it's a literary style in which magical or surreal elements appear in an otherwise realistic and traditional narrative structure and setting. Originally used to describe the work of certain German artists in the 1920s, the term was then applied to literature, in particular to the works emanating from Latin America in the mid 20th century. The Cuban Alejo Carpentier and the Argentinian Borges are often considered the precursors of the form, while the Colombian Gabriel Garcia Marquez brought it to its peak in the boom years of the 1960s and 70s. So from Latin America, magic realism spread around the world, with a number of American and European writers adopting the style or elements of it in their work. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Mixing reality and fantasy. So in magical realism, it's a category of fiction in which fantastic and believable events take place in a realistic setting. Say, for example, a real place. Usually, magical realism is associated with Latin American fiction, just like what I mentioned earlier, but the term has been applied to writing from elsewhere. And magical realism, too, is not a purely Latin American form. And in a magical realist work, characters accept supernatural or unlikely events without much question. To the reader, the amount of realistic detail makes the impossible seem possible. Okay? And we also have some characteristics of magical realism that we're going to discuss. Okay, so let's begin with realistic elements. So, works of magical realism, as you would expect, have realistic elements, such as the places or the setting of the story. Unlike fairy tales or some fantasies, they contain recognizable characters, believable dialogue, a true to life setting, and often accounts of actual historical events. The writer will often employ a matter of fact tone and rely heavily on sensory details to establish credibility. So, just like what I've mentioned earlier, it's possible to include real places and real events that happened in the past or um, few real historical figures. Okay, and the next one, of course, magical elements. Drawing on folklore and myths, magical realism also contains supernatural or mysterious elements. Ghosts may appear, dreams may come true, superstitions and superstitions may prove warranted. People even may fly. Next, we have humor and exaggeration. Magical realist fiction often includes humor and exaggeration. In The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World, for instance, Garcia Marquez uses exaggeration in describing the drowned man. Marquez said not only was he the tallest, strongest, most virile, and best built man they had ever seen, but even though they were looking at him, there was no room for him in their imagination. Next, we have distortions of time and identity. In works of magical realism, readers often encounter distortions of time and identity. In 100 Years of Solitude, the same sequence of events is periodically repeated. In addition, characters may change into other characters, and the usual distinctions between living and dead characters may be blurred. Next, we have political and social commentary. Finally, in many works of magical realism, writers direct or indirectly address important political and social issues, such as racism, tyranny, and conformity. Okay, so we have 5 strategies for reading magical realism fiction. First, we have to notice realistic elements, such as recognizable characters, believable dialogue, and true to life settings. Second, watch for magical elements, including bizarre or impossible events and characters with supernatural abilities. Third, look for humor and exaggeration and notice the mood or atmosphere they create. Fourth, do not be troubled by odd shifts in time and identity. Remember that events are not always presented in chronological order and that characters' identities may change. And last but not least, monitor your reading strategies and modify them when your understanding breaks down. Remember to use the strategies for active reading: predict, visualize, connect, question, clarify, and evaluate.